Today's lesson is Majestic Mount Everest. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And my name is Helen.
And today we're going to go to the Himalayas mountains and talk about the tallest mountain in the world, Mount Everest. Okay, it has different names, but most Westerners know this mountain as Mount Everest, and we're describing it as being majestic. Of course, if you talk about something royal, you say, "Oh, Your Majesty, may I be of service to you." So if something's majestic, it's like a king or a queen. It's just really, really big. It's really, really fantastic.
Yes, the word majestic is usually used to describe something that is impressive, something that is beautiful, but beautiful in a kind of serious way. So you could say that an eagle is majestic because an eagle is beautiful, but not in the same way as a hummingbird is beautiful, because hummingbirds are sweet and tiny. Eagles are majestic because they are impressive. They are predators. They swoop down and fly fast. You can also say that a mountain is majestic or an airplane is majestic.
Indeed, it's big and powerful, and that's how we're describing Mount Everest. But there does seem to be a problem there. People are climbing Mount Everest and causing some problems with garbage and things like that, which we'll talk about in today's lesson. So let's begin our lesson by listening to the first part, and then we'll come back to discuss it.
Majestic Mount Everest. Mount Everest is one of Mother Nature's greatest creations. Its snowy peak has attracted generations of mountain climbers, and as the popularity of the climb continues to increase, so has its impact on the mountain and its surroundings.
大家好，在标题中我们可以看到单字 majestic， 这个字是形容词，指的是雄伟的或是壮丽的。例如 The majestic peacocks strutted around the grounds of the manor. 雄伟美丽的孔雀在庄园里昂首阔步。或者 Northern California is home to majestic redwood forests. 北加州有一大片壮丽的红木森林。接着我们看到名词 generation， 它的意思是代、世代或是一代人。举例来说 This necklace has been in my family for generations. 这条项链在我家已经流传好几代了。又或者说The director's work has influenced generations of movie fans. 那位导演的作品影响了好几个世代的影迷。另外补充这个字的动词 generate, G-E-N-E-R-A-T-E, generate. 它的意思是引起或是产生，像是 The film's trailer generated considerable interest among the public. 那部电影的预告片引起大众极大的兴趣。或是Solar panels are used to generate electricity from the sun's energy. 太阳能板被用来以太阳能产生电力。再来我们看到单字 impact， 这个字是名词，意思是影响、作用或是冲击。例如 Eating healthier food is having a big impact on my body these days. 吃更健康的食物对我最近的身体有很大的影响。或是 The movie had a big impact on me when I was a teen. 这部电影在我10几岁的时候对我产生了很大的影响。另外这个字也可以当动词，念作 impact。举例来说 The politician's new policies will likely impact low-income families the most. 这位政治人物的新政策可能对低收入家庭影响最大。或是 Many cities and towns were impacted by the severe storm. 那场严重的暴风影响了许多城市和城镇。接着我们看到单字 surroundings， 它是名词，指的是在周遭环境或是生活条件。例如 We took a walk around the hotel to get to know our surroundings. 我们绕着饭店走了一圈来了解周遭环境。或者我们可以说 I'll need time to become familiar with the surroundings at my new house. 我会需要时间来熟悉新家的周围环境。
So the first sentence of today's lesson begins with, Mount Everest is one of Mother Nature's greatest creations. So when we talk about Mother Nature, we're talking about that original force that created the world, and we call that force Mother Nature. And Mother Nature has created many great things in the world, and one of those great things is Mount Everest.
Indeed, of course, we could all think of great creations in nature, like the Grand Canyon or the geysers in Iceland, etc. And Mount Everest, of course, is one of the greatest creations made by the Creator, and its snowy peak has attracted generations of mountain climbers. And as the popularity of the climb continues to increase, so has its impact on the mountain and its surroundings. So yes, indeed, we've got generations of mountain climbers. Generations just refers to different age groups, like your grandparents' generation, your parents' generation, etc., etc. And of course, we've had people climbing up the mountain for many, many years. And yes, indeed, the popularity of climbing this mountain is increasing all the time. More and more people want to be able to tell their grandchildren that they climbed to the top of the world.
Yes, so as the climb continues to grow in popularity, so has its impact on the mountain and its surroundings. So impact here refers to the effect or the influence of something. And we're talking about the effect or the influence of having so many people climb up Mount Everest. I could also talk about the impact of climate change or the impact of education on a person's career. So impact basically means the effect or the influence of one thing on another. Now, surroundings here talks about all of the things around Mount Everest. So we could be talking about lakes and land and people who live around the mountain. So surroundings refers to everything that's present in the place. As an example, I could say that the hotel's peaceful surroundings allowed us to sleep well at night.
So yes, indeed, we have all these people trying to climb the mountain, and of course, they are having an effect on the local environment, which we'll talk about as our article continues. So let's do that right now. Let's move on now to the second part, and we'll listen to it first.
Sitting on the border between Nepal and Tibet, Mount Everest is the highest of the Himalayan mountains. It's also the world's tallest mountain in terms of height above sea level, at 8,849 meters. The mountain got its name in the 19th century from the British surveyor General George Everest. However, its iconic status comes in part from another man, Edmund Hillary, a mountain climber from New Zealand. In 1953, Hillary and his Tibetan guide Tenzing Norgay became the first people in recorded history to reach Everest's peak.
In terms of 指的是就点点点而言，或是从点点点方面来看，也可以是根据点点点来说。举例来说 In terms of politeness, you should never ask a person questions that are too private. 就礼貌而言，你绝不该问别人太过于私人的问题。又或者说 In terms of studying for the test, the teacher suggests repeatedly rereading all of your class notes. 就准备考试而言，老师建议要反复研读你所有的课堂笔记。
So now we're going to take a closer look at Mount Everest. Sitting on the border between Nepal and Tibet, Mount Everest is the highest of the Himalayan mountains. So we know that Mount Everest is located on the border between two places, between Nepal, which is a country, and Tibet, which is a region. So the mountain sits between these two places, and it's the highest of the Himalayan mountains. So the Himalayan mountains refers to a group of mountains, and among this group of mountains, Mount Everest is the highest.
Indeed, it's considered the highest mountain range in the world, the Himalayan mountains. And of course, they stretch for a long way through Asia there. But Mount Everest is the highest of those mountains in that mountain range. It's also the world's tallest mountain in terms of height above sea level at 8,849 meters. Of course, there are different ways to measure mountains in terms of height, but here we're talking about in terms of sea level. So regarding sea level, okay, the height above sea level, and of course, it's the tallest mountain in those terms. So if you measure mountains based on how high they are above the level of the sea, then Mount Everest is the tallest in the world.
Right. So in other words, you can use in terms of for saying which aspects of something that you are talking about, you are considering. I could also say, this job is not worth doing in terms of both time and money. So this job is not a good job when you consider the amount of time you have to spend and the amount of money that you get for doing it.
Indeed. And of course, Mount Everest has different names according to where you are. But for Western people, the mountain got its name in the 19th century from the British Surveyor General George Everest. So they kind of named the mountain after him. If you talk about how something got its name, you want to talk about the origin of the name. You know, how did Taipei get its name? Taiwan itself, the name comes from something having to do with the Aborigines. Taiwan got its name from an Aboriginal word. That's according to one theory. And of course, here we're talking about how the mountain was named or how it got its name. That was way back in the 1800s, and it was named after George Everest, who was the Surveyor General for the UK.
Yes, George Everest wanted to climb to the top of Mount Everest, except he wasn't able to do it, and he passed away without fulfilling his dreams. However, its iconic status comes in part from another man, Edmund Hillary, a mountain climber from New Zealand. So even though George Everest gave his name to the mountain became famous later on because of another person. The mountain got its iconic status. So first of all, iconic refers to something that is famous, that represents an idea, a famous idea. For instance, you can say that the Mona Lisa, the painting, is iconic because it's very famous. It's known as one of the greatest Renaissance paintings, so it's iconic in that sense. This mountain got its iconic status. Status here refers to the position of a particular object or a person in relation to other things and objects. So one can talk about a person's social status. In other words, the level of that person in a particular society. Here, Mount Everest's iconic status comes from a man named Edmund Hillary, who was a mountain climber from New Zealand.
Yep, he's one of the reasons why Mount Everest is so famous, why so many people know about Mount Everest. It comes in part or a little bit from Edmund Hillary. Who was he? Well, he was a mountain climber from New Zealand. Okay, and we all know, of course, what he did, which we'll talk about in the next sentence. It says, in 1953, Hillary and his Tibetan guide Tenzing Norgay became the first people in recorded history to reach Everest's peak. So you may have heard about that in history books. Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay were the first two people to reach the top of Mount Everest. And I think they asked Hillary who was the first guy to step on the top. And I guess they just wouldn't say. It could have been me. It could have been him. They left it kind of ambiguous there. So we generally recognize those two people as being the first in history to reach the peak of Mount Everest. We're also talking about Tenzing Norgay. He's a Sherpa, which is a member of a group of people living in that part of the world.
Right, and remember that they are the first two people in recorded history to reach Everest's peak, which means that before them, perhaps other people had reached the peak, perhaps the mountain had been climbed by generations and generations of local people, But it was only when Hillary, a person from New Zealand, a Western person who was able to accept the challenge and get to the peak, that it became big news and was recorded in history.
Exactly. And that happened way back in 1953. And since that time, lots of other people have wanted to climb Mount Everest as well. But it is a dangerous thing to do, and lots of people have died trying. So let's talk about how dangerous it is to climb Mount Everest. Let's look at the final part of our lesson for today, and then we'll talk about it.
Hillary gave his own name to a section of the mountain, which, until recently, was considered one of the most difficult to climb. Known as the Hillary Step, it's a steep 12-meter-high rock face located just before the peak. But a deadly earthquake hit Everest in 2015, reportedly altering the rock face and making it easier to climb.
And what was until recently considered one of the most dangerous parts of Mount Everest also got its name from Edmund Hillary. Hillary gave his own name to a section of the mountain which, until recently, was considered one of the most difficult to climb. Known as the Hillary Step, it's a steep 12-meter-high rock face located just before the peak. So, as a climber, climbing Mount Everest, you might have a lot of trouble in the first part, but right before you get to the top, you come across something called the Hillary Step. So the Hillary Step is basically a 12-meter-high rock face. So it's just a vertical slab of rock, and it's 12 meter high, and it's extremely steep, and it's located right before you reach the top. So the most difficult part of climbing that mountain until recently was going past the Hillary Step right before you reach the top of the mountain.
Indeed, and of course, lots of mountains can be climbed by simply hiking up them with maybe a walking stick and some hiking boots. But if you're going to try to hike up Mount Everest, you will confront the Hillary Step, which is like a cliff there, a rock face, which to me is similar to a cliff. And of course, we've got rock faces on various structures here in Taiwan. Like, I think Daba Jianshan has a rock face there, so if you want to climb up that, you're going to need special equipment. So you need to consult experts first before you attempt something like that. I'm not an expert myself. I just know a couple of guys who did it a couple of years ago. I could ask them after the show if you're interested.
But a deadly earthquake hit Everest in 2015, reportedly altering the rock face and making it easier to climb. So what happened was, in 2015, there was a deadly earthquake, a really big earthquake that killed a lot of people, and it also altered the rock face on Mount Everest. That means it changed the way the rock face was formed, or the shape of it, or its steepness. And as a result of the earthquake, the Hillary Step became much easier to climb. So it's not as deadly as before, and it's much easier now for people to get to the top of Mount Everest, even though the entire climb itself is still very difficult.
Indeed, and that earthquake was probably good and bad. Good in that it made it easier to climb the Hillary Step for new climbers, but bad in that the new climbers could not brag about climbing up the Hillary Step like people before the earthquake could. That's probably quite an accomplishment for people to say, hey, I climbed up the Hillary Step before the earthquake and it was much harder, so aren't I a master mountain climber? But in any case, that's what happened a while ago. There was a deadly earthquake that hit Mount Everest way back in 2015, about 7-8 years ago, and that altered the rock face. It was altering the rock face. To alter means to change something in some way. Okay, so for example, if you don't like your suit, how it fits you, you've gotten fatter, then you can get it altered. You can get it changed so that it fits you better.
Yes, and this change in the rock face was reported. It was reportedly something that happened. And that means that it can't really be confirmed because no official has officially said that this is what happened. This information comes from climbers who have climbed the rock face after the earthquake, and they took photos and they compared those photos after 2015 to photos taken before 2015, and you can see from the differences in the photos that the rock face is indeed different.
Yeah, you could probably do a Google search for before and after photos of the Hillary Step and see indeed if it looks easier to climb now than it did before the earthquake in 2015. Okay, that brings us to the end of our discussion for today. It's time now to turn things over to Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny， 我们来看今天的文法重点。这篇文章的标题是 Majestic Mount Everest， 其中的 majestic 是用来形容雄伟的、壮丽的。那我们来拆解它的字根。首先来看字根magn 或是拼作 magni， 这是表达巨大的、众多的。那这个字根是源自于拉丁文的 magnus， 拉丁文的比较级则是 major。 好，那最高级则是 maxim。 好，这边听起来有点复杂。那其实我们重点是要讲说，我们含有 maj 或者是 max 的字呢，都带有大或者是多的语义。好，那我们的课文单字 majestic， 它是由名词 majesty 加上 ic 而来。那其中这个 maj 表示多， ty 表示名词字尾，那么 ic 是形容词字尾，把它拼在一起之后呢， majestic 可以用来形容是壮丽的、宏伟的。那它的名词 majesty 是指壮丽啊、宏伟。好，我们顺便补充几个相同字根的单字哦。第一个要补充的是 majority， 它的字根 maj 表示多的， or 是比较级，那么 ity 是名词字尾，合在一起 majority 就表示多数。第二个补充的是 magnitude， 它的字根 magn 表示大， tude 是名词字尾，那合在一起 magnitude 表示巨大、重大或者是重要性。那第三个补充的是 magnificent， 它的字根 magn 表示极大的， fic 表示做，那么 ent 是形容词字尾，我们可以用制造出极大的场面去联想到 magnificent， 有壮观的、宏伟的，或者是令人印象深刻的。那我们接着就来看到课文第二部分有一个句子，它写到 The mountain got its name in the 19th century from the British Surveyor General George Everest。 那这边它用到 get one's name from 加名词，也可以用 take one's name from 名词，去表达说由什么而得名，是取名字什么什么。 from 的后面可以接人或是事物。举例来说， The band took its name from a horror movie。 那个乐团啊是取名字一部恐怖片。好，我们顺便补充一个意思相近的用法，则是 name A after B，它表示以 B 为 A 命名。那么 name 在这边当动词，就是表达为什么来取名啊、命名的意思。Name A after B 可以表达用 B 来替 A 命名，把 A 依照 B 来取名。好，那么被动用法则是 A be named after B。 例如 His daughter was named after his grandmother， 他的女儿是以他的祖母的名字来取名的。好，那么以上见重点整理，我们回顾今天单字吧。
Generation. The businessman's money was carefully invested to support future generations of his family. Impact. Recent weather events have had a major impact on global food prices. Surroundings. The child became frightened by her unfamiliar surroundings. Status. The school's status was raised by the high test scores of its students. Alter. The author's strong arguments altered the views of many people.
Well, everyone, today's article has come to an end, and I sure hope you enjoyed reading along with us. I am Roger.
I'm Helen.
See you next time.